In one church, there was a mother and a grandmother of a precocious second grader named Carter. And they went to their pastor and they said, "Carter has a question and we can't answer it. Can he talk to you after worship?" Well, the pastor didn't know what the question would be, but she said, okay, cringing in dread a little bit, for way too often she could get stumped by questions from second graders. But even so, she waited for Carter and his family after Sunday school, and she smiled to herself at the eager expression on the faces of the mother and grandmother. And here was Carter's question. What would have happened if Jesus was never born? And for once, the pastor didn't miss a beat. She said, "Well, Carter, then God would have found another way." Well, God found many ways throughout the ages to bring a message or to help people set a course or to give enlightenment to the world. But the problem had been, and still is, that we humans have a really short attention span. But the thing is, we like to know that we're not alone in our experiences. Perhaps that's why certain stories resonate with us. Just think about the way a child will ask you to read the same book over and over again at bedtime. Stories, shared experiences, they ground us, they help us connect. And when we talk about our experiences in community, I think they also help us make sense of our lives. It's why the Jewish people tell the stories of their ancestry over and over again. It's why we hear the scriptures over and over again. We always have something to learn. We always have something more to share. And in this ever-changing world of ours, we always need to make sense of things, especially in our world today. So once again, we hear the story of fishermen dropping their nets and following Jesus. We also land in the middle of Jonah's story, for if you know Jonah's story well, he was the reluctant one. He ran away from God's call. And his escape plan, unfortunately, couldn't foil the divine plan. But when we look at Jonah and all the other prophets, and Abraham and Noah and Moses, we realize that they had to go it alone. They had a hard job. Who of us feels fully capable of taking on a grand plan, maybe not even our own plan, and carrying it out by ourselves? And those of us who think we can, well, we get burned out pretty quickly. Like the answer to the young boy Carter, God will always find another way if we can't carry out a plan. And so, we were given Jesus. Enter Jesus, and enter he does in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the Gospel of Mark, I don't know if you noticed when Jenny was reading, but it's right in the beginning of chapter 1. And Jesus has already started his ministry. The Gospel writer had a sense of urgency that Jesus needed to build his ministry team right away. The other Gospel writers spend a lot of time on Jesus being born, but not Mark. He wants to get right to the point. That Jesus had a plan, knowing that it would take all types of people to spread God's message. Jesus didn't start either with the rabbis or the political leaders or the temple leaders. He went to ordinary folk who were really good at their jobs. And he just asked them to follow him and tweaked their skill sets a little so that they could do God's work instead. So that brings me to us. When God calls upon us, and God will do so, it's helpful to know that we don't ever have to work for God alone. It says so right there in the text. If you look at chapter 1 in Mark, you'll see what's absent when Jesus calls James, John, Andrew. There's no one individual. There's no one who's being left on their own. There's no one being told that they have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. No. Jesus says, "Follow me and I will make you fish for people." That is, follow me and you'll never be by yourself. Jesus calls them together, not separately. Andrew and Simon, James and John. It's a reminder, and a helpful one, that discipleship, being a disciple, is not a solo profession. And God knows, Jesus knows, that we can't follow Jesus on our own. We can't really do life on our own, can we? We can't live into our vocations on our own. We can't follow Jesus on our own. We need each other. And as I said, Mark begins his gospel with a sense of urgency. The great preaching professor Fred Craddock called this moment when Jesus came upon the men a kairos moment. It's a Greek word that refers to a time in which the constellation of factors creates an unusually significant moment. Things going on in life and in the world all culminate and cause a need for something to happen. It's the kind of time, believe it or not, that communities of faith hope for. We hope for a time that's ripe for change, especially if you're in an oppressed community, or a marginalized community, or a forgotten community. When you have an opportunity to speak up, to stand out, or speak out and stand up, you take it when the opportunity arises. Now, the Bible tells the story, the Old Testament especially, tells the story of the people of Israel. They were waiting for just such a moment, a time when the heel of the oppressor of this one or that one would be removed from their throats. The Jewish people, they trusted the promise of God, that even when everything around them contradicted and their vision of justice and peace, even when everything contradicted the vision of shalom that were at the heart of God's promises. Catherine Matthews said in her reflection on the text this week, the prophets spoke and sang of this hope. And how could the people of God not hold on to it and long for it and watch for it, especially when you were Israel and someone else was telling you what to do? And yet, how do we prepare for such a time? You long for that change, for the possibility of change, and then when it comes, what do? How do you respond when that opportunity finally comes? Well, I can think of one time, and we may think of others as I tell this little story, but back in 1972, Cesar Chavez took the leadership role in fighting for better working conditions for the farm workers in California, the migrant workers. And during that time, the United Church of Christ Synod was meeting in Southern California. And when they heard about this rally going on, the people who were in California from all over our country got on buses and they went to add their voices and their presence in support of that movement. It was a justice movement. Now, for Cesar Chavez, it was an uphill climb to try and get recognition politically, but Chavez knew it was a kairos moment. It was a time when all these factors came together and he had to seize the opportunity. Si se puede was a cry. Yes, we can. And yes, they did. And so today, many years later, the National Farm Workers Movement continues to stand up for the rights of farm workers, protecting them from the dangers of pesticides, poor working conditions, and abuses by some employers. So you may have imagined some other situations like that. I think of the civil rights movement, the suffragette movement. There's so many times when people have seized the opportunity. So what about today? Have you paid any attention to the news lately? And I know some of us find that a painful experience, and so we choose cautiously what we listen to and what we read. But if the news is anything to go by, I'd say we have a constellation of factors that tell us we are living in a significant time. Even last week, as we commemorated Martin Luther King Day, there are still those, not just in the world but in our country, for whom equality is simply a word. The abuses of racism and sexism and xenophobia exist, and it seems are popular with some of our political leadership. I don't usually get political, but just this weekend, there was a second Women's March on Washington, and Hartford, and Portland, and state capitals around the country. And it wasn't just women. It was spouses, partners, family members, friends. And it wasn't just women's issues they addressed. They addressed the issues of humanity. Equal treatment in the workforce. Justice in our courts and in the social arena. Just immigration. Just health care. And the important work of diplomacy that builds foundations for peace. You know, they're not Democratic or Republican issues, they're issues of faith. If the time has come, and believe me, the people in pain out there can attest that the time has come, the good news is we're not alone in our concerns, and our need to stand up and speak up. We're not alone in that either. But we need each other to take the risk to step out and stand up. We need to tell our own stories so that others who have kept silent for years and years can tell their own stories. And it all boils down to Jesus' call to follow me, because it's more than just a mere following. It's believing that you follow a God who desires a relationship with you, and that relationship allows you to reach out to others, to encourage and empower one another, and like Kay told our children, to tell people about Jesus, to ask them to follow along with you. No matter how Jesus asks you to follow, whatever your calling is, whether it's a ministry to the poor or to be an advocate for immigrants' rights, you aren't Jonah. There's no need to run the other way, and you don't have to be afraid that you won't make a difference. Don't forget the inescapable power of God to help you along. You are the fishermen who get sent together. You are the Mary Magdalens and the Marys. You and I are accompanied the same way Jesus built his ministry team, the same way Cesar Chavez helped migrant workers. We can follow, we can say, si se puede, yes we can. Yes we can make a difference, not only in one another's lives, but in the world